Just welcome. My name is Megan, and I am a naturalist with Dubuque County Conservation. And one of the areas of this job that I absolutely love is getting to do wild edibles. It's something that I've been doing for about 2 years now, really kind of getting into it and learning what's out there and actually making stuff out of it. So it's kind of a passion I have. I'm going to share my screen for my presentation here. All right. So many of us kind of know the common garden plants like tomatoes, carrots, and corn, and often can easily recognize even the plant that those come from. But most people have never really learned about what we can find and eat from nature, except for a few of the fruits and nuts and berries. So today we're going to kind of go over why you would even want to think about picking wild edibles and eating them, the benefits and hazards that go along with it, how to actually forage, and a few different wild edibles that can be found right here in Dubuque County. So why should you even eat wild edibles? They do have many great benefits. Many are highly nutritious and can be even more beneficial than many store-bought foods and vegetables. Just kind of an example, the dandelions, they are an excellent source of vitamin A, C, and K. They contain vitamin E, folate, small amounts of other B vitamins, and they have a good amount of minerals as well, like iron and calcium. So you can see like it does provide lots of healthy nutrition for us. Also, we always kind of talking about shopping local. It's also good to eat more local. And what can get much more local than eating something that grows sometimes right in your backyard? They pretty much grow near you anywhere in the world, especially here in Dubuque County. We have a pretty wide variety of things that you can find. And then not only is there health benefits from actually eating the plants, but it's also a great health benefit with the combination of hiking and gardening. You can get out and hike, and so that kind of brings that other health benefits to it. Some benefits of wild edibles. Kind of the first point I want to bring out, there's many things that go beyond just the nutrition. One of the benefits is fighting against nature deficit disorder. And you might not have heard of this before, but what it pretty much means is just that it's becoming more common that a lot of adults, even children, are not getting outside enough anymore. And this term was introduced in 2005 with the publication of Last Child in the Woods, Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder. It is not meant to be really a medical diagnosis, but it is to help talk about the movement to work towards connecting children, adults, and whole communities back to nature. Collecting wild edibles gives us kind of the reason to get back outside, and you can do it by yourself, with family, friends, so you're bringing more of that community back out with you. The loss of connection with nature has led to a diminish of our senses, attention difficulties, obesity, high rates of emotional and physical illnesses. So foraging for wild edibles can kind of help us getting that connection back to help with all those problems. And according to Dr. Hughes, experiencing nature is thought to provide health and well-being benefits. Studies have revealed that children are healthier, happy, and perhaps even smarter and more creative when they have connections to nature. Nature has positive effects on children with the attention deficit disorder, asthma, obesity, and being in nature even helps relieve stress and improves physical health, according to Ray Cho. So you can kind of see those benefits do start to build. And it's not necessarily wild edibles, just the fact that it gives you a reason to go outside. So it kind of builds off that. Some other benefits include getting to learn about the local area, especially if you're interested in kind of the history. You can learn the history of the plants and the areas, what they were used for. And then we like to try and avoid pesticides and herbicides that get sprayed on a lot of food these days. And so this is, and although like eating organic and local produce is a great goal to have, it can definitely have kind of that financial burden. It can be costly. but this is a much cheaper way to go about it, and you're still getting that local food around you. And then another benefit that you might not really come to mind at first, but because it doesn't really affect us directly if you're looking for wild edibles, but it is an important part to the health of the native species plants that we always want to be growing here. You kind of help fight against invasive species because some of those can be eaten, and so you're taking them out of that environment and they won't be able to grow back, and so you're clearing areas for new native species to grow, and some of those might be native wild edibles as well. With all the great benefits, there are some hazards that you do need to be aware of and keep in mind. Some of these may seem kind of obvious, some are ones we don't always think of right away. A big hazard to be aware of is the location. You need to make sure that you have permission to be on someone's land. You don't want to start crossing boundaries because then that's going to give foraging kind of a bad name, because a lot of us really like to protect our property. And also know if you're going to use one of our public areas, like one of the Butte County Conservation Parks and public areas, that you know where you're going, which parks you are allowed to do that. And then knowing the rules and regulations of those parks as well. You should check that the area is not a preserve. You're not allowed to collect and remove anything from Swiss Valley Nature Center Preserve. A lot of people are very familiar with that area. And it does have a lot of great wild edibles, but they're not allowed to be picked. The purpose of the area is for the wildlife, to make sure we maintain that for them. So humans are not allowed to remove anything from there. That also includes you can't from IPC Forest Preserve or Pullman Prairie Preserve. But any of our other parks, our regulation states that it shall be lawful to collect the fruit of all nut and berry producing plants for home use, provided the collector not otherwise damage the parent plant. Collection of any nuts and fruits for any commercial purpose is expressly prohibited. Mushrooms may also be collected for home use. What that's just kind of stating again is that in any of our other parks that are not our preserves, you are allowed to collect nuts and berries from plants as long as you're not damaging that parent plant, that host plant. But that does mean there's a few wild edibles out there like wild leeks, wild ginger, wild onion, that you're not allowed to pick because that involves taking the part of the plant that helps it grow. And so we don't want to be damaging those populations of the plant. A lot of those are already becoming a little bit more rare. You might come across a big patch of it, but those patches are becoming less and less. So that's why we only allow nuts and berries, because you're not going to be able to collect every nut and berry of a plant. And so there's still going to be allowed reproduction of that plant. Except for invasive species, you're also allowed to collect the whole plant of those, like garlic mustard is an invasive, and since we want to try and promote native plants always growing in our areas, you are allowed to collect these. Another hazard you also want to be aware of is what is around you in that area. So if you're going on your own property or you ask someone else's property, you might want to be aware of the farms that are around there, because if they use pesticides and herbicides, those chemicals could blow onto the plant that you're about to collect. They can kind of soak into the ground, and that water could move those kind of chemicals. So you want to be aware, because those plants can soak that up, and you would end up ingesting those if you collect plants right by a farm. That goes for your yard as well. You might not spray your yard if you're collecting a dandelion or something, but maybe your neighbors do. And so there's another possibility of those chemicals coming over to your yard and being on those plants. Something to be aware of and be cautious about. You want to avoid areas that are close to a busy road. That's kind of a source point pollution. There could be gas or oil leaks. You never really quite know. when we come right out of winter, there's a high amount of salt and sand that's going to be on plants and in the road ditches. So you might not want to really collect next to those roads. Anything that gets to the sides there gets soaked down with the water. Those plants take it up, and it's basically you eating those chemicals with it. See, another is the poisonous lookalikes. For a couple plants, you really want to make yourself aware of what the wild edible looks like compared to a lookalike. They don't always grow in the same conditions, though. Sometimes they have a lookalike, but it doesn't grow at the same time of year. So you're going to want to research knowing what could be out there, and it's important to know if you're going after a certain wild edible, what time of year it grows, so that you know you are absolutely sure that's the correct plant that you want. And in a moment, we're going to look at a few of those examples as well. So on our first slide, we talked about one of the good benefits of wild edibles is being their nutrition, but that can also, on the other hand, be kind of a hindrance and something you should be cautious about, because our bodies are not quite used to such high concentrations of nutrients. You want to be careful and start off with small quantities of a plant that you're going to eat to make sure that it doesn't give you a huge burst of nutrients that aren't going to be healthy for you, because our bodies are only supposed to take in so much a day. You don't want to go above that. Also, because you might not be allergic to anything, but these are new plants that you probably have been tried, and you want to take a small quantity to ensure that you're not going to break out to anything. And not only are the plants possibly hazard to you, but you can be a hazard to plants as well. We want to be careful of not over harvesting. There are a few species, again, like I mentioned, wild leeks, wild ginger, that are becoming more rare in this part of Iowa, partially due to invasive species. They get shaded out, they don't have enough nutrients to grow. And so since they're native, though, we want to continue their growth. We want to encourage that. So either you can avoid those plants and not pick them, or if you do happen to come across a nice big patch of those plants, kind of the rule of thumb for harvesting is to only harvest 1/3 of the plant material and to leave 2/3. That allows for reproduction of the plant, and it also allows for, if there's any animals and wildlife that depend on that food source, that it's still there for them as well. And then the last kind of hazard to think about is there are noxious plants out there. A lot of us have heard of poison ivy, nettles, and wild parsnip, but you'd really want to make sure that you're familiar with these plants, because if you're going to go foraging, that means you're going to be off the path oftentimes. You're going to be into the weeds and the plants, and you want to make sure you know what plants to avoid. I know I definitely break out to poison ivy. I always make sure to wear like pants and high socks so that I don't get any of that on me. I try to avoid those areas if I see a big patch of poison ivy. So you definitely want to become aware of those plants and know what they look like. Some poisonous lookalikes here. Kind of a saying I grew up with hearing was red and yellow kill a fellow, purple and blue, good for you. Although for the most part, that's pretty true. It's not always true. Looking at the example between grapes and pokeberries, pokeberries are something that can make you very sick. Yes, it's a purple berry, so it says it should be good for you, but it's not. It is pretty much just for the birds. So we want to avoid that. Even all those sayings we hear all the time, even the leaves a 3, leave it be. It's a good rule to avoid poison ivy, but there's other plants like wild strawberries and wild blackberries that also have 3 leaves. So you can't listen to all those kind of poems if you're going to go out looking for wild edibles. And again, looking at the grapes to pokeberries in the 2 pictures, they look fairly different. You can definitely tell the difference of what's going to be what. The grapes have a big bunch in them. They're slightly bigger than the pokeberries. The pokeberries have a very nice pink stem. But when you're looking and foraging for wild edibles, you're gonna start to notice a lot of food like grapes, they don't grow nearly as big as what you would find in the grocery store. So they might end up being closer to the pokeberry size. The other thing is other animals are going to be at it. Birds like to eat them and anything else that can reach them. So there's going to be fewer in a bundle. You're not usually going to find a big bundle of grapes like that out in the wild. So things might start to look pretty similar between grapes and pokeberries. But that's why you want to make sure you know more about the plant, because the leaves of both those plants, they do look vastly different. If you follow the stem up and find a leaf attached to it, you're gonna start to notice what a grape leaf looks like compared to the pokeberry plant. The stem of the pokeberries is very pink. Grapes start out a little bit pinkish red, but they usually turn to green or brown, so you're gonna notice that difference as well. I'm not sure exactly when either of these fruits do come into ripeness during the season, but you'd want to know that also. Another kind of poisonous lookalike, which people might have heard of a little bit more familiar with, are when we look at morels. The picture with the lighter colored, that is a true morel that people love to search for right in May. The other one is called a false morel with this kind of slightly more reddish cap. If you're an avid morel hunter, you start to learn this pretty quick. You can tell right off the difference, but if you haven't hunted for morels, they're definitely look alike. They could be very similar. The false morel is definitely something not to eat. Again, it can make you very sick. So you can learn, there's different ways to kind of begin learning the difference between two species. Sometimes false morels, if you aren't confident in just looking at it, when you cut the stem open, it's shown on the bottom picture, you can see that the stem goes all the way through and only connects at the cap, while a true morel, the stem connects right at that bottom of the cap. So that is another indicator of which one is a true morel and which one's a false morel. So just researching different things, make sure you know what plant you're after and look up what different lookalikes could be for that plant so that you're aware of those plants as well. You want to research both kinds of plants. Now, if you're interested in wild edibles, you're going to have to know a little bit more of how to forage. The first thing I would definitely suggest if you're going to get serious about foraging, the internet is a great thing to have and to look up to find original information. But if you're out foraging, you can't always get internet connection on your phone. So it's a good idea to get a guidebook that you can always bring with you. I still like to have them with me, or at least read through it right before I go out to find a certain wild edible. They have very good descriptions typically about the habitat, when something's going to be ripe, where they like to grow, and all those sort of information, and gives you good pictures. That's another big thing, is a lot of us like to look at pictures, so it will give you all those kind of details. So the Scout's Guide and the Nature's Garden, the two top pictures, those are the two books that I have and I really rely on. But there's definitely a few other ones out there that are focused on the Midwest. That really helps narrow it down, because if you get a book that's just general to North America, it can get kind of overwhelming trying to flip through all those pages, as a lot of those plants don't necessarily come back to us. So the Midwest Foraging and the Mushrooms of the Upper Midwest is another good book, especially if you're interested in mushrooms. Let's see. To go out foraging, again, even though the books do talk about the habitat, you're going to want to make sure you research that particular plant, about their habitat and species you're interested in collecting. Know everything you can. You'll start to learn that there are certain plants like cattails they prefer marshy areas, so you're definitely not going to go on top of a hill to try and find that sort of plant if that's what you're going to go after. There's other ones that really like shady areas, so you're not going to look around in the sun. So you're going to start to learn kind of the habitat of each of those plants and knowing where they like to grow, that just helps limit your search so you don't have to hike around everywhere. And then if you continue to forage, you'll start to kind of learn throughout the seasons when different species are going to be ripe. There's early spring edibles, there's midsummer. Right now we're going into like mulberries and blackberries. Gooseberries are coming in to be ripe here pretty soon. So you'll kind of start to learn all the different seasons of growing seasons for these different plants. So it's important to learn those, especially if there's a certain plant you want to go after. You're going to want to know what season to go out. You don't want to go out in early spring if you're looking for blackberries, because you're not going to find any right then, sorry. The other thing is know which part of a plant is edible. So some plants like dandelions, every part of that plant, from the flower, the leaves, the stem, the roots, any part of that plant can be eaten. Doesn't mean they all taste the same and don't all taste great all the time, but it can be eaten. So it's important that you know that's okay if you were to consume a certain part of that. There's other plants like wild ginger where you only want the roots of that plant. The flower and the leaves are something you're going to want to discard because they don't have any nutrition for us. And sometimes also like May apples, they are a little trickier because they have a fruit that is only edible once it is perfectly ripe. You don't want to consume it when it's still green because then it can make you sick. So also knowing when something is okay to eat or not. And as you continue to forage, I would suggest starting to keep a notebook or a journal of different things that you have found and when you found it, where you found it. That's going to pretty much help you create your own calendar of events and plants for you. It's just going to help start to narrow things down. Sometimes these books say a plant is going to be ripe at a certain time of the year, but you never quite know with different elevations, and this season, with less rain, if something's going to be a little bit behind or early, you can kind of start to learn what plants are going to be ripe when looking at your specific location that you're collecting from. And continuing with how to forage, if you are interested in any plants that grow in a marshy area, you're going to want to know your water source. So again, like cattails are a pretty popular one. I've collected lotus seeds, which are lily pads and the seeds that grow off of those. So you definitely want to know your water source, because if you go to a contaminated water source that, again, is next to a farm or something, next to a busy road, you might get chemicals that soak into that water. Those plants are going to end up using that water, and the chemicals are going to be into them. And especially if you're going to eat anything raw like that, it's basically like you're eating and drinking contaminated water. So that's very unhealthy for us. And especially with the fact that if you're collecting wild edibles, you're definitely trying to avoid adding any extra chemicals into your body. Also with those chemicals, and there could be heavy metal pollution in that water, and even those can't be taken out. Even if you cook and boil or anything like that, that's still going to be in that plant, and you'd still end up consuming that. You want to make sure that the plant itself is healthy. Plants also get fungus, they get disease, insects that can get into them. You don't want to eat anything just kind of like animals. If it looks kind of a sickly animal, it's not something we would want to consume. The same goes for any plants. You want to make sure that it's a healthy plant that's growing, has no fungus, no disease that got into it. You want to make sure that you look for any signs of that. It's a good idea to start with common wild edibles. You can easily look that up in one of those books or on the internet. A lot of the plants I've mentioned today, like blackberries, cattails, garlic mustard. Those are all fairly common, easy to identify. They don't have really any poisonous lookalikes that are gonna cause you too much harm or anything. So it's a good idea to start with those. That way you don't get overwhelmed. If you tried to just go out to the woods and you have never foraged, there are a lot of different things that can be edible, but you are not necessarily going to be able to pinpoint them very well if you're not common with just a few to start with. And I would, each time you go out, you could maybe add on a plant, but I would start with one or two that you feel very confident, know the information about it, habitat, location, all that. And then you can start adding on those wild edibles as you go, as you begin to feel more confident, you start to understand what you need to know for each plant. If you do get really into foraging and you already have a garden and you can't always get out to the woods or something, a lot of these plants can be transported and planted into a garden. That's a lot of how the invasive species have gotten out anyways, as they were once in a garden. Now they grow out in the woods because they can't always be contained the best, but you can start to grow your own. Blackberries are a pretty easy thing that if you put it on one row of your garden, you would always have blackberries right there for you instead of having to go out in the woods and find them. And you kind of have a little bit more control over animals then that way, so that you can ensure you find it and have the best quality there. You want to continue just always working on your skill. This is definitely not something you can just kind of get into, only look up a few things and think you're gonna be really good. You do have to make sure you do your research. You need to continue doing it. You do it each year, you're gonna grow, you're gonna start to learn all the different things you need to know. So just continuing to work on your skills is definitely gonna help when you go foraging. So we're just gonna look at a few common wild edibles that you can start with that are easy to identify. And the first one I kind of want to start with is garlic mustard. This is one of the first wild edibles that I kind of started learning how to identify, collect, and make something out of it. So kind of the history of garlic mustard is it is a wild edible that grows here in North America. It was originally brought here from Europe as a food plant, a plant to help erosion control and as a medicine. It has now kind of started to take over places because the seeds that grow on one plant, it's over 60,000 seeds that grow off a plant. So it can definitely easily transport itself and regrow. So it has become kind of an invasive. The problem with that is it displaces a lot of our native plants, which working for Dubuque County Conservation, our goal is always to try and keep native plants. We want to try and get rid of invasive. So it's nice to be aware of that, to know if you should pull the whole plant, if you should just take part of the plant. So this sort of a plant, since it's an invasive, you'd want to just pull the whole plant just to try and help kill that off, to try and stop the spread of this. And they also have an allelopathic, which is a chemical that inhibits the growth of other plants. So that's just kind of the history and impacts of them. To identify garlic mustard, it has you can see in the picture, it has small white flowers that grow on top and with 4 petals. Those are usually in bloom more in early spring. And then the leaves are the big giveaway. They are alternating and triangular shaped, and they also have very coarse toothed leaves. So both those pictures kind of show that. So you'll start to learn those pretty quickly. So then you don't always need a guide with you. You can easily pick those out if you go out foraging. They only grow to be 3 to 4 foot tall, sometimes a little shorter, sometimes a little bigger. So if you found something that was 7 foot tall that sort of looks like it, it probably isn't that same plant. So you want to know the height of this plant. And it does give off kind of a garlicky smell if the leaves are smashed. And it will grow in most areas. It grows in shade or sunny areas. It's not very picky at all. Now, What I make with garlic mustard, one of the things I enjoy is garlic mustard pesto, because you're going to go out and collect wild edibles. Not only is it a challenge to figure out what you can eat, what you can't, but knowing what to make with it. And some people, they can pretty much go out and collect anything and everything and have a whole meal. I know a few good recipes that are more like snacks that I enjoy doing. So garlic mustard pesto is a pretty simple thing to start with to see if you're interested in this kind of wild edible, and to see if you like a certain food. You don't want to collect a whole bunch of one plant, try to make something out of it and not like that food. You want to just start off with small quantities so that you aren't wasting any food. So garlic mustards, you only eat the leaves of this plant is what you're going to collect. And for this recipe, you need about 4 cups of those leaves, and then some toasted walnuts, sunflower seeds, cashews, whichever you prefer. I've always used walnuts, olive oil, Parmesan cheese, and lemon juice, and then salt and pepper just to taste. And the crackers are just to put this pesto on and eat. And I also have a mini food processor, and that's what I use to mix all of this. When you collect a wild edible, you need to make sure that you wash each plant pretty well, because it is out in nature. It is going to have more dirt and more bugs on it. So you want to make sure that you can get it as clean as possible. With garlic mustard leaves, you submerge the leaves in water, kind of swish it around, dump that water back out, and then do that 3 times or so until the water's starting to look clean, so that you feel confident that what you're eating, you're going to consume, is going to be clean for you. And then for this recipe, in your food processor, you just blend the garlic mustard leaves, the whatever kind of nut you choose, Parmesan cheese, and lemon juice. And I use the chop setting until you just get it ground down pretty well, whatever consistency you like. And then you kind of begin to drizzle in olive oil, your salt and pepper, slowly starting to mix that in until, again, it all seems to be mixed well and you reach your kind of to your liking. And then you just put it on a cracker and enjoy. So it's pretty simple to put together. Also, with this recipe, the garlic mustard pesto can be frozen. I really like recipes that can be frozen, because if you want something, say you're just craving something in the middle of winter, you're not going to be able to go out and find those wild edibles at that time, but you're able to pull something out of your freezer to enjoy again. Another very popular wild edible that I'm sure many of us are familiar with, if you ever go out in the woods, these are around, they're going to be ripe here soon. Someone told me that they're ripe by the 4th of July, which is, I think, going to hold true this year. And that would be blackberries and black raspberry, whatever name you go by. They like to grow at their habitat is they grow kind of on edges of woodlands, fields, along paths, any of those kind of areas. They like partial shade more and slightly disturbed area. So that's where you're going to find those, which is nice, because if you don't want to be hiking into the woods very deep to avoid poison ivy, parsnip, or anything like that, these are right on the edge, so you don't have to go very far and can avoid those sort of things. It's good to know the identification. Yes, it's easy to pick out that ripe berry, but knowing what the plant looks like gives you an idea that if you go hiking earlier in the spring, you're going to start to notice where that plant is growing, and you can easily come back to that spot with ease instead of having to go back out and search for that plant later on in the season. So they have a thorny bush with thorns on it. It tends to be light green and arcs towards the ground. The year before growth turns reddish, purple, brown kind of color. There's usually 3 leaves, and then the fruit is a compound, and it turns black to dark purple in color when it is fully ripe, and it's very easy to pull off a plant. If you're having a problem when you try to pull most berries come off easy. If they're hard to pull off something or stems are breaking off with it, that means that it might not be perfectly ripe yet. And then their harvest time is typically in early July is when it's going to start. And these are another great thing that you can either eat these raw, put them on ice cream. My favorite is to have blackberry jelly. That is definitely what I like with them the most, or put them in a pie. If you are interested in freezing these, they can also be frozen. What is suggested is to put them on a cookie sheet to begin, put them in the freezer, let them freeze, then place them in a bag and put back in the freezer. But that just helps so that they don't get smashed. And they keep as whole as you possibly can until you're ready to use them. Just quickly, a few other Dubuque County wild edibles. There's ramps, wild leeks. I make a ramp butter with those. Stinging nettles is another one that a lot of people are a little scared of to think about because we try to avoid that plant, touching it. You do have to make sure that you are being careful when you harvest and prepare it, but it just gets placed in the oven with some like garlic salt and pretty much turns into a chip. Well, after it's been in the oven, it is perfectly safe to eat and tastes pretty good. It's just kind of a quick little snack to have. Another one that I think a lot of people know about are black walnuts. They are pretty labor intensive though. I have done it before and my grandparents do it a lot. I've learned a lot from them about the whole process, but it's very rewarding, but some wild edibles take a lot of work. You have to be willing to put that work in because you have to dehusk and clean and crack. And they're not like your English walnuts that are easy to crack. These are much harder. So you have to know what you're getting into if you want to do something like this, or you can always just stick to easier ones. Wait until you feel confident in what you're doing before you start adding into that. And walnuts go great with just eating or just adding into any other foods, add a little health nutrition to them. Many of us know morel mushrooms, but there's also oyster mushrooms. The white ones pictured here are the native ones. There's also golden oyster mushrooms, which are an invasive species that also like to grow around here. And either one, it's one of my husband's favorite. He's kind of the one who's into mushrooms and he pretty much just fries them. Sometimes he cuts them up and cooks them with some of our other food, but they're pretty easy. Those three kinds of mushrooms are pretty easy to identify. Other mushrooms, you do have to be careful. Mushrooms are kind of you need to be careful if you're going to get into that. Make sure you really know your mushrooms because there's a lot of poisonous ones out there. So that's why we pretty much stick to the morels and the oyster mushrooms. It's just because they're easy to identify and easy to cook, and we're not worried about having poisonous lookalikes for those. And then one last one, which a lot of us consider weeds, but again, I mentioned earlier, are dandelions, and any part of those can be eaten. The stem is a bit more of a bitter taste, I've heard. I haven't tried that part, but I've had the flower part, which doesn't have much of a taste, but it's kind of fun to have kids try because they don't think about eating dandelions. Otherwise, you can pull the leaves for a salad. There's also in that Scout's Guide, the Scout's Guide to Wild Edibles that I talked about earlier. There's different recipes to do with those. One of them calls for a dandelion donut, and I believe you use the flowers for that. So there's definitely lots of different things you can try with them. I believe you can dig the roots up and dry it, and you can turn it into like a dandelion coffee. So it's pretty interesting, all the different things that are out there, and definitely to try lots of different materials. So thank you for listening to my talk about wild edibles, and I hope you kind of learned something new or excited to get out, try and collect your own wild edibles. Does anyone have any questions for me?
We were wondering if you had mentioned early on about some of the Dubuque parks that do allow this. Can you give any specific names? I know you had said, like, I think Swiss Valley, no, depending.
Yeah, so there's 3 that you cannot. That's Swiss Valley Nature Preserve, the IPC Forest Preserve off of Old Davenport Road, and Pullman Prairie, which is sort of out by Durango. Any of our other parks, according to my boss, are fair game. A lot of those are like wildlife refuge areas. So we already allow hunting and stuff like that. most of that doesn't take place when you would go foraging anyways, but so you're allowed to collect things from there. But again, it's only the nuts and berries. You can't take any of those other ones that would destroy a plant. So there's like John Deere or the Proving Grounds, one of our new areas, or
Like Mines of Spain, would that be a place?
So that is run by the city at the moment, but I don't believe that's a preserve. I believe you can collect there, but that is something you'd have to look into. That's not one of our parks, so I'm not 100% sure on the rules for that area. But again, you want to make sure that you check with that as well. Always, any new area go, make sure you know the rules and the regulations of that spot.
Okay, thank you. It was very informative. We appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So Megan, I have a question. I belong to a group on Facebook, and this spring they were talking about wild asparagus in ditches. I have never heard about that before. Is that something we would find around here? I'm sure it's too late in the season now because it's an early spring. It is too late in the
season. Yeah, my boss came in this year with some, and yeah, it does grow in a lot of road ditches and places like that. So I just make sure that you don't go in a very highly used road. It's not something I really go out and search for, but there are people that they pretty much know where like it's gonna grow and it gets taken right away. So that's why a lot of us don't see it very much. But it is something that is found around here. It just kind of grows wherever. So yeah, it's something that if you're interested in, you'd want to learn exactly when it's going to start coming up. It's harder to see because it looks kind of like a thick blade of grass, I guess. And so if you're not out searching for it, you're not usually going to notice it right on the side of the road if you're driving. So that's why I think it's not usually as popular as like morel mushrooms. They're pretty easy to identify, and it's not next to a road, so people get out a little bit more with that. So anything else, or we all good? All right, well, thank you guys for listening and coming to the talk. So
yeah, thank you very much, Megan, for this. So we have been recording, and we will try and get it posted today or Monday, and then we'll send the link out to hopefully the email list that everybody will get.
Yeah.
So thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
We appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
So it looked like we had 5 join.
5, all right. That's a few more at least.
So, yeah, not nearly as many as I was expecting, but it's so hard to know. Even when we had in-person programs, we would have.
We just had a program on Wednesday we allowed 10 people to sign up, and 3 of those people showed up. So it's always hard to know exactly what's going to be a hit or miss, or if people remember exactly. I think that's a big part of it sometimes.
Is Swiss Valley, and not Swiss Valley, is New Wine Park one that you guys have?
Yes, it is.
Is that would that be a good location for a?
Yeah, it definitely is. It's got a few hiking trails, so that's like a good place to start, but it's not as highly used, and so there's going to be more likely it's not going to be picked through. That's a problem with some areas that people are very familiar with, or people hit those areas right away. So if you're after like blackberries, because those are easy to identify and people really enjoy them, they can be taken from an area really quickly, and it's hard to find them. So we kind of want to find those areas that, yes, you can collect from that, and people maybe aren't quite aware of that. So it's going to be around for people to collect then.